So I'll talk a bit about civil rights. And civil rights, I mean, a lot of people think about the civil rights movement as clearly about Black America and, sort of the rise of African American activism through the 1950s into the early 60s, leading up to, and certainly including, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of '64. And of course, that is the story in many ways, but there's so much more to it. Let's call it that's the current that runs through this, but it's also the influence behind a vast array of other movements from the 1950s into the 1960s and early 70s, all of which are designed around civil rights. The question is whether, what kind of rights do I have as a citizen of this liberal democracy? And is my subjectivity to be, am I meant to think of myself as a second-class citizen, or are other people going to think of me as a second-class citizen? And so, by 1954, we see the sort of rise of some figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, in the United States and the southern states, where the Jim Crow system is in effect and has been for the better part of a century. But we also see major changes in the structure in the United States. In 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education, and landmark civil rights case in the Supreme Court, which effectively ends school segregation. This is the beginning of the end of Jim Crow, which is the idea of basically the apartheid system in the American South. The idea that there would be a whites-only bathroom beside a colored bathroom, or things such like. Now, so as this is happening, there's a huge upsurge in Black activism in the United States. There's a great deal of African American organization around sit-ins, around lunch counters, trying to integrate places. Integration being the primary goal of the early civil rights movement. A really kind of liberal understanding of Black America as being secondary to white America, and that being out of sync with the liberal ideal of equality. So let us make America equal. And it was really calling out of the hypocrisy of the idea of a kind of apartheid operating in the country. Now, what that also does is it brings to front of mind for many young people across the United States and Canada and beyond the very concept of Black America. I mean, for a lot of people, this was like something you didn't think about. And it's an amazing awakening that you can experience in reading media from that period, but also recollections from in memoirs and contemporaneous reports of white people, non-Black people, in other words, across the United States and Canada, who suddenly become aware of the idea of oppression of Black people, and become aware that this is a pressing issue that must be dealt with. And there's an awakening on white college campuses in Canada around what was falsely perceived to be an American problem, as though there were no race issues in Canada worth confronting, that people had to get involved, and they had to work to fix this problem. And by the late 50s, early 60s, as the civil rights movement is gaining momentum in the United States with bus boycotts, sit-ins, but also real pitched battles with police in racist states, there's a real upsurge in interest in Black America among white intellectuals, college students. And this is picked up on by Norman Mailer, among other people who pay close attention to culture. And Norman Mailer, in a very famous and divisive article in 1957, I want to say, or 58, referred to what he called the White Negro. And the White Negro was very much this idea of a white, probably middle-class person, well-educated, with all the reasons in the world to live their cookie-cutter life in their Cold War suburban scene, who has somehow come to believe that their life is inauthentic, plastic, fake, meaningless, unfriendly. And they look around and they see in Black America something authentic, something real. And that realness, I mean, there's all sorts of problematic ways that that is manifest. I mean, real and authentic tends to revolve around poverty and oppression. That people who live in, who are impoverished and who grow up under the jackboot of racism, etc., somehow live more authentically because they don't have the means to live otherwise, or they don't have the means to have pretensions. There's all sorts of problems with this construction, but this was meaningful by the late 50s. And there were burgeoning groups on university campuses and in arts groups, such as like the Beat movement in poetry, often called the Beatniks, in poetry and literature, that openly idolized Black America, or aspects of it, or an imagined version of Black America. And so while there is significant activism against the unbelievably unfair structures of racist America that's taking place among Black Americans, there's also this kind of parallel upsurge in interest in what they're doing, and interest in all of these things related to the authenticity of Black life and Black culture. And so, you know, you see in novels like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, this sort of famous beat expression of I guess what Mailer would have called the white hipster or the white Negro, is he talks quite openly about, you know, I wish that I were a Negro, because they really feel the life, they really feel the world, you know, this kind of romanticization. So again, there are problems with that romanticization because it's overblown and fairly, and in some ways condescending, but it's also really meaningful in terms of its what it inspires in people by the late 50s and early 60s. One of the things it inspires is a widespread interest among white college students to get involved and work alongside Black men and women in the civil rights movement. And a lot of Canadians, but many more Northern Americans, white, often head down south to get involved in the boycotts, to get involved in the marches, to get involved in what was called Freedom Summer, trying to integrate the polls, trying to get Black people registered so they can go and vote. And all of this, again, leads up to the final, to a certain extent, final end, which is the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which effectively makes it illegal to prevent Black people from voting. Now, that great success, and there are lots of drawbacks to it. I mean, many people had a huge problem with the very concept of liberal, of the equality approach, of the liberal approach to civil rights, thinking that instead it should be more about Black power, about generating a kind of Black racial solidarity and pride that was to operate alongside but not necessarily integrated with the white superstructure, because this structure itself was what was rotten, not, and therefore Black people shouldn't be aiming to try to join it. They should be aiming to try to refigure it in such a way as to make it more human and less racist. Someone like Martin Luther King then stood for this liberal equality ideal, and somebody like Malcolm X, but also Stokely Carmichael, and eventually people like Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which arises by the late 60s, tend towards the other side of this. The idea that it's not just that the laws aren't fair, it's that the whole system is racist. And so you can't just fix it by a Voting Rights Act. It's much bigger than that. Now, not to say that Martin Luther King was as so naive as to think that the Voting Rights Act would end racism, but these were the kinds of debates that go on. So don't make the mistake of thinking of the civil rights movement as leading up to the Civil Rights Act, which gives everyone the vote, and then done. So by no means is the story over. Part of the reason we know the story isn't over is because all of this is influential to all of these other identity groups that I sort of alluded to earlier. So you've got probably most primary among those is the feminist movement. And by the early 60s, you've got a bit of a sort of clarion call in Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which is a book about basically the boredom and alienation of the housewife. The idea that women feel trapped, many of them, in the home. The drudgery of day-to-day cooking and cleaning, and feeling as though they can offer so much more to society, but the society doesn't seem to be interested in what they have to offer. This book, it becomes a bestseller, both in the United States and in Canada. And it spawns, rather quickly, a great deal of dialogue among women and men, but in particular women who either feel strongly that this is true and that they should be doing something about it, or who condemn Friedan for speaking the illicit truths that should be kept secret. Of course, there are also women that can condemn what she says because it sounds to them as though she's attacking the housewife as a kind of victim of false consciousness, somebody who, if she's happy, is only happy because she's been taught to be happy, but she's not actually happy. Now, that kind of thing. So it's an influential moment, and that's about 1962, 63. This leads rather quickly into the development of an organization called the National Organization for Women, or NOW, in the United States. In Canada, there is, in quite short order, there's a group called the Voice of Women, which pushes to get a royal commission called on the status of women, which is the kind of thing we do in Canada when we need to answer a question. We call a royal commission, and they spend 5 years studying it, and then they come back. So in both countries then, real activity is taking place to address the idea that civil rights for women have not actually yet been achieved. One of the things that happened, again, with the feminist movement that some way parallels what happens with the civil rights movement for African Americans is a similar split along the lines of integration, i.e. liberal feminism, which is represented by Betty Friedan in the National Organization for Women, and what is came to be referred to as radical feminism or liberation feminism by the late 60s. So these women's liberationists, or women's libbers, as they were sometimes, most of the time unaffectionately referred to, tended to see the entire society as patriarchal, as organized around the principle of the subjugation of women. As was famously put by, unfortunately I cannot remember which radical feminist said this, was that we don't want a bigger piece of the pie, we think the pie is rotten. We want to throw out the pie, i.e. So overhauling the system becomes the radical feminist approach. And a great deal of debating goes on, a lot of it very healthy, some of it quite destructive, around the idea of women in North American society and what equality should look like and what forms might it take. We also see the rise of the gay and lesbian movement. By the early 1970s, it gets really going, but in the summer of 1969, there's the Stonewall riot in New York City, which in many ways heralds the coming storm, really, of gay and lesbian activism, but also public performance. And this is a really important thing. I mean, like, the rise of disco in the 1970s is intimately connected with a newfound freedom on the part of gay men in particular to perform their gayness in public, to be openly gay and celebrate it. Campaigns like Gay is Good reflect that from the early 70s. Gay is Good is it's a one step removed from Black is Beautiful, which was a call from the liberation side of the black movement by the late 60s. Sisterhood is Powerful would be the radical feminist version. So I mean, these liberationist groups are all in their ways reflecting on the successes, gains, trials, and tribulations, really, of the early black civil rights movement of the 50s. Learning from them, trying to overcome different but similar and interconnected structures in liberal capitalist society which have caused inequality to develop.